Welcome to FFRF's Ask an Atheist. I'm Annie Laurie Gaylor, co-president and co-founder of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. I'm in the Stephen Yoel Friendly Atheist Studio at FFRF's office in Madison, Wisconsin.
Hi, I'm Mark Dan, Director of Governmental Affairs at FFRF in Washington, D.C. Today, we're talking with an atheist town council member from Black Diamond, Washington, Council Member Kristiana De Leon. Black Diamond is a small community of about 6,000 people, roughly an hour and a half outside of Seattle in King County. When Kristiana began to run in 2019 for the local town council, she thought she would be talking about roads, transportation, diversity, and congestion, only to find out that her opposition and incumbent council members were staunch Christian nationalists and heavily involved in organized hate groups like the Washington State Three Percenters. We'll talk with Councilmember De Leon about how she has gone up against organized hate in her community and won. Councilmember De Leon can be found on Twitter at DeLeonChristiana as well.
Welcome to Ask an Atheist, Kristiana.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. This is a huge honor.
So before we talk with you, Kristiana, here's a news story from King, Seattle, looking at some activities of one of the hate groups, Patriot Front.
Stickers touting a white supremacist group were placed around the Maple Valley area over the weekend. The stickers are of Patriot Front. The Anti-Defamation League defines them as a white supremacist group that disguises their message through the veil of American patriotism.
What actions do we take when we see this hate to combat it? Because we are not powerless.
Allie has lived in Maple Valley for 8 years. She asked we not show her face. She says racism is still an issue in the area.
I have seen incredible amounts of empathy and acceptance within this community and the exact opposite. But I believe that this community truly cares for each other.
So we've had a total of 3 cases in 2020.
Black Diamond Police Commander Brian Martinez says the messages on the stickers have no place in the community.
You know, some of the literature that was, or some of the words that were being placed on these stickers were stuff like "One Nation Against Invasion," "Better Dead Than Red," "Not Stolen, Conquered." Placing the stickers on private property can count as malicious mischief and sometimes can be more serious. And if they're continuously doing this, and depending on the manner in which they're doing it, it could also be malicious harassment as well.
In a statement, Black Diamond Council member Kristiana De Leon, who's championed efforts to eliminate hate speech, condemned the stickers, writing in part, "The group show even a pandemic can't quarantine racism."
I hope that people understand that the community is stronger than this.
Tony Black.
When we are silent, we are complicit and they win.
King 5 News.
If you have questions for Councilwoman Kristiana De Leon, please ask them in the Facebook comments or send an email to askanatheist@ffrf.org. And please remember, FFRF is a 501c3 nonpartisan apolitical group. So we happily accept your tax-deductible donations, but we do not and cannot take sides in partisan elections, and we don't necessarily endorse any such views that might be expressed here. So go ahead, Mark.
All right. Well, Kristiana, so thank you so much for joining us here today. Obviously, seeing news stories like that are incredibly shocking. What was your reaction when you saw the stickers, and how does that relate into what's been happening in the town?
Yeah, no, it was really, really upsetting. But honestly, this was why I also wanted to get involved in serving my community. Actual groups like Patriot Front have been prevalent in the Pacific Northwest for a really long time, and including in my community like Black Diamond now and in nearby cities. I was teaching at the time when I first got aware of some of these posters or some of this sloganry, and it just made me absolutely sick to my stomach to see this going on, because here we are in this part of South King County that's only getting more diverse, that's more growing in diversity, and here we're seeing this kind of backlash. So this was really what got me started. I was working on a local inclusion kind of proclamation, just language that could be held for accountability in the Maple Valley area. That's what made me think, I want to get involved in serving my community, because this is something that we desperately need. So when I saw this soon after I was elected, it was like, this is why we need this kind of language. We need accountability for our electeds to say that we need to be better than this. And even just like the last few weeks, Patriot Front has been appearing again. So this issue is not going away unless we do something, and unless we say something. So if we don't stand up, this will continue.
Yeah, and it sounds like this has been a problem that you have had to contend with for quite some time. So when you were running for town council, when did you realize you weren't always going to be talking about transportation congestion and diverse changes within the town? And this was in 2019 when you started running,
yeah.
correct?
Correct, yeah. So I ran because of this kind of stuff, because of the roads, because of things that really brings people to wanting to serve in an office like a city council. I found out about a week later, where someone said, hey, have you checked this out? And I was absolutely just like, I have to get even more, like, it wasn't just it was going to be a great experience to be part of this democratic election process and really exchange ideas. It was like, no, I need to win this, because this is exactly what got me into the race. This is exactly why I wanted to serve. And to see that I had an opponent and a seated incumbent, appointed incumbent, who was espousing views that were absolutely against everything that I and my greater community stood for, I just knew that I had to really, really make sure I did everything I could to really promote values that were far better than this.
So this is your opponent, correct, that we're looking at?
Yes, yes.
And when people think about Washington State, we tend to think of it as a liberal bastion, bright blue, and yet that image seems to have been tarnished after people get out of Seattle, Renton, Tacoma, perhaps. So, what is Black Diamond like, and why doesn't it fit the Washington State liberal image?
Yeah, absolutely. To get really into hyper-local politics, there's a big dichotomy, I'd say, overall with, what Seattle, quote unquote, looks like, and then the rest of the state. And of course, that makes it really interesting when we're talking about smaller communities like ours. And if you're talking about Eastern Washington, if you're talking about areas like South King County, we're often kind of overlooked in that narrative. So it's really just important to recognize the fact that even when we're talking about quote unquote really blue areas, how we really talk about those values can also look really different depending on where we are. So this is an area that has historically been voting more conservative. I do believe that some of that's just changing along with the rest of shifting dynamics and demographics throughout the state, especially because South King County is home to some of the most diverse communities in this nation. So all of that is changing, but historically, we were a small coal town and, also standing on the traditional lands of the Muckleshoot Nation. But, these have been really recent shifts overall. So I hope that helps answer that question a little bit. But yeah, we and lots of other areas like Washington just do not fit the Seattle narrative, quote unquote, and actually in a lot of ways go out of our way to say that we're not.
And the image we shown of your opponent a couple minutes ago, and if Bruce can and Buzz can put that image back up, can you tell us who this is? What is he doing? And I am a Washington 3%er. Tell us more about what on earth is happening in this picture.
Yeah. So this picture was actually taken in the interim between when he lost his council race and before he, I think, maybe even realized he had an opportunity to get reappointed to the council. So this is Chris Wisniewski.
Your opponent in 2019, correct?
My opponent in 2019. So he was appointed after a recall election, which is a whole other just story in and of itself. And so then he was serving, he lost the seat. And yes, and that was just him just deciding he was going to be especially out and proud with this organization because it was out anyway.
Can you tell us, I don't know what that means. I'm a 3%er.
Sure, yeah. So, oh my gosh. So the 3% are one of these, paramilitary militia groups, whatever you want to call them, that have this sort of start in, it goes way back. It was actually historically a reaction to the Obama administration and saying that the 3% of the colonists rose up against British colonialism. So that's where it came from. It's not actually even historically accurate, but that's where it came from.
I see.
Yeah. So they're just another one of those groups that, and locally still, they organize with the National Washington, the national 3%, even though they claim to be disavowed, they still use their manifesto, their resources, they share the same connections. They work with the Proud Boys. There's another local group that's Patriot Prayer that they've been heavily involved with as well. Oath Keepers, definitely. So they're just another one of those groups.
And in the 2019 election, how much did you beat him by?
I beat him by 3%.
That is really funny.
Poetic justice, yes.
But at the same time, okay, so you're running against Wisniewski, who is a proud member of a hate group that got identified before during the election campaign, essentially runs on it. And what we're showing here, not only is he a member, but he's in leadership of a hate group.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's, I think, the incredible part of this is just, wow, you have someone on a city council who is on a group that is unabashedly utilizing symbols, imagery, actions of white supremacists. And I think that's what makes this so scary, and especially in a blue area, thought of as a blue area for many people, that you can have elected leaders who are out and about white Christian nationalists and leading that charge.
Absolutely. And that's what was really frightening about all of this, is the fact that this is, you may have heard some local news stories saying things like, QAnon is trying, QAnon affiliated people and groups are trying to make their inroads in city councils and in school boards and places like that. And this has been ongoing for a really long time, with that effort to sort of build the bench, quote unquote, with these kind of smaller local races. And we get complacent about them. We feel intimidated. We don't know where to start. We don't know what a city council does. We don't always know everything that a school board does. And in that sort of I think, hesitancy to get involved, there are plenty of groups that are really utilizing it to gain this kind of legitimacy. And now they're feeling threatened by it because people are pushing back. And, so it is scary. But it's all the more reason why I think it's really important to speak out and say we can aspire to better values in this.
So can you tell us more about how you encountered this white Christian nationalism and supremacy in your candidacy and in your work once you won that election as a town council member in Black Diamond?
Yeah, so I think one thing that I kind of was reflecting on was, I remember this moment where I told my friend at the time, when I was campaigning, that I kind of realized I felt a little bit like Frodo. At one point I thought I was just going to take the ring to Rivendell. And then I was like, oh my gosh, I have just tumbled into this rabbit's hole. This is wild. I was just discovering all of these things along the way that even though, I was in education and I was thinking that I was also learning about and part of trying to combat hate groups, there was so much I didn't know. And so that's sort of okay, I'm doing more than taking the ring to Rivendell. In a way, I really have to win this. This is a huge issue. And here I thought, this is a small town race where, we would kind of maybe have a little arguments over zoning laws or whatever. And here we are in the face of this. And yeah, so as I think I previously mentioned, I just discovered this a week after filing, or a week or two after filing week, and just discovering the hate imagery and the language and, the racism, and also all of these connections to, yes, this white nationalism intertwined with Christian nationalism, the xenophobia, the Islamophobia, all of these things. And as I kind of kept running that summer, I just kept learning more until it just came out in the local paper, where I guess they caught on. And, that was what happened in October, was a huge article that said, yeah, he's a 3%er and this is what this means. And I don't know how that ended up, reflecting or changing things in the election. But for me, it was just an absolutely galvanizing moment for me and for local volunteers who were like, we can't stand for this.
So did your atheism come out at all when you were running, or since then?
Yeah, I'd say more, I've been more out since then. I have considered myself to be an atheist and a humanist for probably close to a decade. And that was something where, I was I was out, but it wasn't something that really made any sort of difference when I was on the campaign trail. This wasn't a question that people asked about or had come up a lot. People asked a lot more about, maybe at most, not all the time, but sometimes about party affiliation or things like that were just more closely connected to governmental ties. But I decided to really do a lot more being truly more out in public with being a secular humanist and an atheist really this year, because I thought, this is me, and it felt a lot better to be more open and out about who I am. So since then, I've also been able to join the Association for Secular Elected Officials. And that's been just a wonderful opportunity to really say, we are here because we care about things like roads and good governance and, our environmental policies and things that people actually want, that are better things for our lives, not this kind of, gosh, all the things.
They want this world. We want to live in and improve this world and stop worrying about some unknown, unseen, unprovable world, correct?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And
yeah, because this is,
You call this as the Association of Secular Elected Officials, is that right?
That's correct. Yes.
And is that a Washington state group, or is that nationwide?
That is nationwide. Yeah. So we are from all over the country. At least in our board members, we have the East Coast, we have Montana. So it's just really putting out there that, we are your neighbors, that we are here to promote good governance and hopefully do a little bit of destigmatizing along the way. So it's been a really cool opportunity to be part of, and definitely in stark contrast to a militia group that has been organizing with somebody who had a state representative who was actually labeled as a domestic terrorist for his participation in Christian warfare. So, while they're going around pouring oil on the state capitals, as this guy did, we're actually going up those steps to try to, actually get some policy done.
So it's such a sea change in my lifetime, having been a founder of the Freedom from Religion Foundation more than 40 years ago. We would know of public officials who were not religious. They would whisper in our ears. This is remarkable. It's such a welcome change that there are more of us, and people don't feel that it's a kiss of death to be an atheist and run for public office. So congratulations.
Thank you. And I'm really happy I did it, because I realized when I was kind of in that whispering, as you kind of mentioned, I realized that I was still playing into that narrative that it was something to be ashamed of. And it's just as, important and legitimate as being part of any faith group, and if we're here to share our same values, that's what matters most. And I think that kind of representation truly does matter.
And also, you ran and won by 3%, not
Yes.
exactly in a bright blue area, and definitely in a more swing area of the country with a lot more conservative voters. And I think that's really impressive. So if you have any questions for Councilmember De Leon, please ask them in the Facebook comments or send an email to askanatheist@ffrf.org. So just the next stage in the story of strangeness that's been going on. You win by 3% in November 2019. You defeat Wisniewski. He then gets reappointed to the town council, and then COVID hits, and that's when things start to get weird. That you have two council members from Black Diamond, Wisniewski, and who we can show a picture of again, who we mentioned earlier, and also, in his, let's say, fashion choices might be a good word for it, and another member of council, Nelson, and they decide we're going to start going to the pro-COVID protests in April 2020, so as well. And so now you have someone who, white supremacist, reappointed to town council, said, we're not going to refocus or reorient. We're going to double, triple, quadruple down on this and go to the pro-COVID protest with more white supremacists, more militias in Olympia. What on earth happened?
Oh my gosh, yeah, that was in and of itself such a ride, because here I had like this opportunity where I won. I was just trying to get acquainted to all the things that, entail going from being a candidate to being an elected official. It's always kind of a leap and a lot to just transition mentally and emotionally, et cetera. But yeah, then hearing that there was somebody who ran for a different seat unopposed who decided not to fill that seat was just terrifying. And two people ended up coming forward to try to fill that appointed seat. And one had some amazingly good credentials, was not known to the council, but, was also just I thought would really make a nice addition to the council. And the other one was Wisnowski. And it's like, no. And you first off, and just in any, I would think just otherwise too, when you freshly lose an election, and you're the only, and that's the only election that was actually on the ballot in this city. Everything else was kind of unopposed. That should say something, especially when someone was an incumbent and was endorsed by two conservative parties. And he still ended up losing. That should have sent a message. At any rate, I remember very distinctly in February of 2020, when the entire militia leadership, including their leader, Matt Marshall, and others that I knew from just the rabbit hole I had to kind of uncover about this over the summer.
And that's the gentleman we just showed with the Constitution.
Yes.
And he's a local school board member, not too far from you.
In
and
2019,
he's the head
he was
of
running.
And he's the head of Washington 3%, so more white supremacists in local politics, not too far from you. Great.
Yes. And he's still on some social media platforms and deplatformed from others. But yeah, he was actually running for this seat in 2019 for the Eatonville School Board. So again, they had 5 going throughout the state where they were just trying to get into local elections so that they could eventually serve into even higher office. And yeah, so they all came out in support of Wisnowski, and it's like you could just hear a pin drop, but seeing this entire 3% entourage in front of a local council meeting where none of them really lived in the city, and it took, after a really long conversation where we were debating, I still remember, but I ended up being the only person to vote no against Wisnowski's reappointment to the council. And I mean, in some ways it shocked me. In other ways, I realized he was the appointed person the first time. So there was some of that dynamic going on. But it really just also shook me to my core that here was an election where the people have spoken. And that seemed to be, at the very best, that was still an incredible disregard for the democratic lowercase d electoral process. And the fact that they came to intimidate and then they went online and they would just be trashing on this was another thing. And this was just in my first few months on the council, right before COVID hit. And then in March of 2020, of course, there was COVID. It was Washington State. This is King County. So we were really front and center in the very early days of the pandemic. We shut down right away. And so here I am trying to learn how to be a council member in and among a council where I wasn't really the one who was expected to win and all the dynamics that went with that. And then it was shut down. And then all of a sudden we start meeting again. And along the way, I learned that, they went to these early on COVID, pro-COVID protests in Olympia that also ended up making a lot of splash and a lot of news. And they showed up in their cosplay triad outfits and the whole bit.
And so this picture, you can kind of see, this is Councilmember Wisnowski, who you defeated, who got reappointed, and then in April doing in his colorful I've seen some pretty interesting Hawaiian t-shirts. That is probably the most obnoxious. That's an insult to Hawaiian shirts I've ever seen. I don't know what that is, but it was a fashion choice, so let's go with that. And defies the governor's orders and hangs out with more militia members in Olympia. Wow.
Oh, yeah. And remember, this was all the early days of the pandemic. We were still not entirely sure how it was spread. All of these things, and we weren't really, and especially in the grand scheme of things, in lockdown or in quarantine for that long. And here was all of this early on bubblings of, well, this is our rights and this is our tyranny. And, little innocent me in April 2020, this was my wake up realization to how quickly polarizing and political a pandemic got. And that was because of these kinds of events where we went so quickly from let's all get through this together to what you now see on the daily news today. And yeah, they were marching with other white supremacist groups, and including that meant people who were holding their Confederate flags. That included people who were showing a lot of those early on images that came to be really known, especially in January 6th. There were actual out neo-Nazis at these events. And that's when, members of the public also saw it. And there was just a lot of general outcry and frustration, because it's like, first off, we didn't appoint them. And second off, we didn't elect them. And second off, what is this? This isn't our values. And so that was just a wild ride.
Yeah. And then, so in addition to Wisnowski, you also had another member of the town council. We had council member Nelson. So I think we have a picture of him. So in this picture, tell us what's happening with this. This is not exactly the usual tour of the Capitol in Olympia. I'm sure of it.
No, as much as these kinds of groups have continuously tried to make it so. My goodness. So this is Patrick Nelson. He was appointed
on the left.
Yes, on the left, with the hat and the goatee and all that. He was appointed in September, I believe, 2019. The council voted while I was running, and right after I filed to run for election, to just create 2 more seats on the council. There were some legal reasons and justifications for it, but at the end of the day, it wasn't necessary at that point of time. There was not good information getting out about these seats, and all of a sudden, lo and behold, only 2 people decided to apply to go for these 2 newly established seats, and one of them was Patrick Nelson. And as I later came to learn, he is also one of the Washington 3%ers. And I've also learned since, when he broadcasted it, like, he isn't even legally allowed to own a firearm since the early 90s. So this is scary stuff. And yet he was kind of literally able to just walk onto council. And here everyone's like, well, are you going to run for that seat? And I'm like, no, I'm not going to apply for this seat. I really wanted to run for office. And even without all the other wild dynamics going on, this was the only opportunity in the city to have actually a say in who was elected, because nobody else was running with an opponent. And it seemed very critical to this process that there was actually a choice on the ballot, even if that meant I didn't end up getting to serve. So anyway, that was him. And that's him in Olympia, standing next to an outed neo-Nazi, I think, who came from Portland, wearing Hello Kitty pants along with this neo-Nazi attire. And that was part of what I ended up speaking out against, was how much outrage there was about these folks who were not even put into office by the will of people, who are now going around and even defying even our mayor's order about, like, these COVID lockdowns and shutdowns.
So Kristiana, you made a public statement, is that right?
That's correct. And that's correct.
The gist of that was that what? The conclusion that actions speak louder than words? Yeah,
that was definitely part of it. So as we're pulling it up, it was essentially, look, I learned about this. This isn't okay. I agree with the folks in the community who are outraged. And I don't think that this shows that they are really, responsible for holding this office, and they shouldn't be serving in this office anymore. And especially when you compound the fact that they are doing everything in a sense to sort of promote the spread of a deadly virus. And then, like, they're going out of their way to make sure that we are still in this pandemic. And then also doing it with these groups that are absolutely white supremacists, white nationalists, is all of it just incredibly inappropriate and wrong. And that's where I said, look, we need to change this. And that's what I ended up speaking about in one of our first council meetings back. Like, this was not what I wanted to do. I really wanted to actually just engage in governmental work. But when I see this, it's like, this is also part of governmental work. It's pushing back on these narratives and allowing them to flourish because we're too afraid to confront them.
So what happened when you made that statement, and what also happened to those council members when they got back from Olympia? And here's the statement we're finally seeing.
Yes.
Maybe we should read that It says, perhaps you both will say that you do not agree with the ideology of these kinds of groups, but when you directly and literally stand with Proud Boys, neo-Nazis, and Confederate flag wavers and similar groups in solidarity, it leaves us no other conclusion that your actions speak louder than your words at the dais. So, so what happened when you made that statement?
That again was really my wake-up call for realizing just how polarized we'd gotten. You know, it was kind of like this Jimmy Stewart or you know, Elle Woods moment where I thought, okay, now we're really going to speak to accountability. And in some ways, almost the opposite happened. I know there was threats to have me censured and have me removed from the council. There was a few folks who decided to go after, you know, and I mean, this is their right, but the response from other community members who were supportive of him was to do things like request public records and things like that. So it was definitely highly retaliatory after that. I know that I got calls back, you know, saying that I wasn't living up to being inclusive and welcoming because I was being so mean to Chris and Patrick. And it's like,
you were being
right.
so mean to Nazis.
Yeah, and really I was asking for a modicum of accountability, which was simply asking, maybe you should reconsider the fact that you aren't serving everybody. You're serving the opposite if you are prioritizing your own ego and your own bravado and all of this over, you know, both what voters wanted and even more about what our community needs. You know, because I was like, look, you're council members. If you don't like the way that things are happening with the governor or with anything in Olympia, you can write, you can speak with your legislators. You know, there are lots of ways that you can advocate for the things that you want in ways that aren't putting other people in danger and aren't legitimizing groups that actually put even more communities, and especially diverse communities, people of color, in harm's way by what you're doing. So yeah, that was kind of the first reaction, was just I got actually a lot of condemnation from my council members on what I did. And you know, I mean, there were plenty of people who also were happy with what they did. But again, I think there's that fear. So there wasn't as much of that same kind of out loud pushback. And that's really why I think it's so important that we continue this narrative, as so many people are afraid of these kinds of violent intimidations that are going on.
Was there any pushback? What happened to the council members after they got back from Olympia? Did they have any flack, except from you?
In a lot of ways, no. I do know that, unfortunately, I do know one of the council members did actually receive an actual threat as a result of this, which I have absolutely condemned and is absolutely not okay. That is not at all what we were asking for. You know, so it was just, that did unfortunately happen. And it's since created this sense of like, you know, this martyrdom mentality of like, all we were asking for was accountability, to recognize that was wrong and to possibly leave your office, no other things being done, but otherwise, no. Eventually, though, Patrick did step down from the council. He moved out of the city, so that was the reason why. It was not as a result of anything else that was being done. It was just a personal decision. And eventually, also, Wisnowski has chosen not to run to fill his seat, but he has other folks who have stepped up who are willing to carry that torch and pick up where he left off.
Wow. And so we have an audience question from Heather Johnson, and she wanted to know, have you received any threats from Christian nationalists and other white supremacists?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I have been threatened online by some of these groups and harassed, and just some wild misinformation that went out. I know somewhere then down below in some of the comments, they did make some jokes that pertain to my own personal physical safety and shooting me. I also know
that's not
that
very funny. It's not a very funny joke.
No, and actually the people who were doing that were actually adjacent to some other local campaigns, including one who was helping support somebody who was challenging our state representative. So
did those get investigated, Kristiana? Did that get investigated?
It got reported to the FBI, but I don't know what was done with it since. The FBI has, yeah.
Glad you reported it.
I did, and unfortunately, I really have to say this is not unique. They have harassed a lot of activists before. They've directly mailed and sent threatening letters to people people who spoke out against them. And I do have some really close friends who are continuing to face this kind of backlash and this pushback because they are speaking out. And it's one of those things where I do believe the more that more of us really call attention to it and question and just interrupt that narrative, I do feel like the people who are standing up will be safer. So unfortunately, that's going on. There's even concerns of local candidates this cycle who have been watched, who have been like kind of stalked and like at their houses, like people have actually been camping outside of their houses, and other kind of threatening things too. So unfortunately, that's kind of the backlash. It's like, I'm not unique, but in a lot of ways, a lot of more people have had it far worse. And it often just, that's the story that often goes untold. And it's all violence and intimidation.
And Anna Ben Dixon is asking, so was sexism something you've had to battle with? And did sexism play a contribution, you think, in a lot of people's reaction to calling this out and being just and not supporting white supremacy?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I could go into all the little details I have of just those kinds of microaggressions that people, including women and non-binary folks, experience. But absolutely, yes. And I do know that that was part of the backlash and part of, I think, why there was also that sort of frustration with me speaking out. I could go into the dynamics of what that means, like in some meetings, but yes, long story short, yes.
Well, is your council, what's the number of men versus women and so on? Are you one of the few women?
I believe so right now. So here's the funny thing. When I was running, it was actually, and this is unique, but it was a majority women on the council and a mayor who's a woman. Let's see, we've had a lot of people who left council and been reappointed since. So I'm kind of trying to count now where we're at, but I do believe women are in the minority now. I think there's 4.
Well, that's something.
Yeah, it is something. Yes. But there is also something to be speaking to the fact that there can be a lot of internalized misogyny. And also when that goes hand in hand with the misogyny and the sense of patriarchy, and then how it does conflate with white nationalism, and how especially a lot of white women definitely do gravitate towards spaces where there's more of that interest and power. And that often is in some of these kinds of groups. That has been historically the reality of our nation for centuries. So we are currently a majority women council. That being said, the dynamics of gender go a lot more further than that.
And then I think it's important to note, when the protests in Olympia did happen, folks came back. What was the reaction from the mayor? And also, can you tell us a little bit about the mayor as well, about her?
Yes. Well, the mayor was one of the ones who called and got really mad at me for saying what I said. And I mean, that's unfortunate, right? Because like, this is just about the fact that these council members were even going against the mayoral orders. So it's been dicey, because I do know that there's still too much, I'd say overall, in the council. There's too much of an interest or an enabling or whatever you want to call it of this kind of activity of groups like the 3%. And I really, really do hope that we eventually realize that there are far better ways to connect our residents to resources, to activities in the city. So it's definitely not been a walk in the park in terms of that dynamic or that relationship as well. And I just hope eventually we kind of come to realize that there's a better way forward.
Great. And if you have any questions for Councilmember De Leon, please ask them in the Facebook comments or send an email to askanatheist@ffrf.org. And Kristiana, you mentioned that Wisniewski, the fine gentleman in the pineapple shirt, he is not running. Nelson has gone back to Texas, where they, as you mentioned in some of our earlier conversations, because they've got better, their gun laws are much broader than Washington State. So he is going to be choosing to be in that environment. But what you said earlier is a little disturbing, that even though Wisniewski is not running, it looks like there are some 3%ers and white supremacists who are looking to take his place and pick up where he left off.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know that with that, he's Wisniewski's getting a little bit more spicy because he's like, I don't have an election to win. And also I know he's kind of trying to just do more of these outright, nicer community gestures, or doing more just kind of like hobbies that I think all the rest of us would find acceptable, like, gardening and stuff. And I think to some extent, I kind of want to sort of flag that in and of itself as well, that, when we think of these kinds of like groups or affiliations, we really do need to be thinking about the fact that these are our neighbors, and these are our neighbors who do things like go out and garden and like, go to, soccer practice with their kids. That's not like this sort of like wild, Darth Vader kind of thing going on. Right. This is really like, these are neighbors. These are people who look quote unquote normal, and yet they're engaging in activities that really threaten and intimidate the very fabric of our democratic institutions.
So didn't Wisniewski tweet something about the gallows?
Yes.
And what was that about?
This was about holding accountable, if I'm remembering correctly, maybe our Attorney General. So this was during some banter with him and with Matt Marshall and some of the others who are engaged in the Washington 3%. And this was back in December of 2019. So after he lost the council seat and before he was reappointed. So this was one of those, the true colors were showing, because he thought he wasn't going to be in office. And of course, now that we, at the time, this was the common language of the 3%. They've since been deplatformed from Facebook. But this was the common language that they were using, was things like executing government officials, hanging people, and, having things, and joking openly about civil war. So the fact that he showed up in his Hawaiian shirt, boogaloo shirt, before that was really catching on to the national narrative, is all, to the point that there's a lot of coded language. There's a lot of things that look super benign or maybe just a little bit silly and ridiculous, but are actually connoting a lot of deep meanings. And that's where it's really important to just know these symbols, know these signs. But yeah, they were joking about it. And of course, now we look in hindsight about January 6th and go, well, that aged poorly. It was never a good idea to begin with, but that's not how you talk about government officials. And especially if you have just been serving in public office, there are so many ways that you can really use your opportunity to leverage things for your community. I know we got connected because I was also trying to work with our member of Congress on things that also pertain to local issues on infrastructure. Like, this is what we should be doing. But yeah, and also to go back to that earlier question, there is somebody who's running to keep a seat who is also just part of the QAnon movement and part of all of this as well. They've shared the same campaign manager. He's definitely supporting them. So it's kind of where I go back to our state representative who was labeled a domestic terrorist, Matt Shea. He chose not to run for office, but somebody else who was just as supportive of his ideals without that same kind of baggage ran for that seat instead. So it's that same kind of thing where it's like, well, maybe I'll just go off in the corner, look like the nice guy who wants to just do these nice, benign hobbies. This guy could do it for me. And that's why you really have to know what's going on in your local elections. They are so important.
Mm-hmm. And many secular elected officials are running up against major disinformation campaigns online about vaccines, January 6th, white Christian nationalism, neo-Nazis. And how are you able to overcome these barriers in your town and help people see the dangers of what is happening? And the thing that it's always very scary is that these are people who live next door, but essentially the terrifying thing is, how do you overcome essentially your neighbors becoming radicalized?
Yeah, man, that's such a good question. And it's so unfortunate too that groups like Light After Hate and other groups like that have really suffered severe, cuts to their funding since the Trump administration, where there are a lot of organizations that are really working towards that sort of better way forward. But, it really, I can only keep reiterating that it is so important to just follow these elections. And, it's not great that we have off-year, quote-unquote, elections, like these odd-numbered, elections, but you got to know what's happening and get involved. And really do your homework there. And especially because like in our voters guides, you only get so many 100 words, you know, so we had a candidate, you know, this Wisnoskin saying, well, I'm a patriot. And I'm like, you know, and that's like where that was, again, that coded language where you're like, okay, great. You know, and at the time in 2019, I think almost everyone say, oh, great. You know, you love your country. I do too. But then it's actually coding for the fact that he's part of these kinds of things. So again, more of us need to speak out, interrupt the kind of, you know, even like the jokes and the racist imagery or language that we hear, because otherwise this is what goes unfettered. And while we're over here too worried about really speaking up and also being proud of who we are, you know, this is the group that's going to have the monopoly. And then we will end up playing into their narrative that we are somebody to be ashamed of, you know, and that includes secular atheists. Like, there is nothing wrong. In fact, quite the opposite of being an atheist, of being a humanist and serving in public office. So it's about also getting people back to issues that care about. At the end of the day, these folks are bullies, you know, in the kindest sense of what I could be describing them as, you know, and it's fascism too. They're fascist bullies, right? And at the end of the day, they don't have policy ideas. They have fear mongering. You know, there's all this misinformation about vaccines and, you know, quote unquote, critical race theory, but no actual policies about getting better things done for our students in the school board, or about our roads, or about holding, you know, large companies accountable in our cities, and about better zoning and better environmental protection. So because there's that sort of like absence of policy and really making a difference, we gravitate towards these kinds of things, since, you know, they do this instead. And we have to keep pushing back that there is a better way forward.
So I'm not sure if there's any more questions coming in. Mark, do you have another question? Because I have a question, if not.
We've got a few more.
Why don't you go to those?
Kristiana De Leon is quite popular. One is, do you think you'll receive any backlash for appearing on the show and being so outspoken and calling this hate out?
I have before. Every time I've done that, you know, it was interesting. Even when I spoke out against Patriot Front, which is, you know, that actual true neo-Nazi group with a fascist symbol. They're prevalent, especially in the Pacific Northwest. And I did get some pushback of, well, why did you not go to the council and, you know, let us know that you were going to be on TV? It's like, I don't know, because they asked to interview me. Like, you know, so it's just like, this is the wrong question to be asking. The real question is, why aren't we doing more to combat this on our downtown? Like, I've seen some of these, and I was, you know, having to also call it out and report it. Like, why are we more angry about calling light to this problem than the fact that it is a problem? And that's where I really found it interesting. And going back to even some backlash, even earlier this year, we were going to create a social media policy where Wisnosky wanted to have this amendment where, you know, council members can only ask each other permission, you know, if they're going to talk about each other on social media. It ended up getting rejected because of public backlash. But his reason was, well, my name was dragged through the mud. It's like, well, you play fascist games, you're going to win lowercase d Democratic prizes. Like this is what
you put those things on social media. You didn't make up things about hanging the attorney general. That's come on now. I mean,
no, exactly. Well, and precisely, and that's it. Like, everyone's saying, oh, this was a liberal hit piece, and like when the local news came out with this major story about him being on the 3%, they're like, oh, that was just them out to get me. And it's like, they quoted you. All they did was show screenshots of things you said, which were incredibly racist and homophobic or xenophobic, and, you know, saying things like dehumanizing immigrants. Like, these were your words. If you don't like that it's a hit piece, like, maybe that shows you actually find this wrong, right? So yeah, I might get backlash from this. However, this is where I really feel like if we don't do this, and if more of us don't do this, this is where democracy dies. And I can't live with myself if I don't continue to speak out and share what I know, because unfortunately, I've gotten to know this a lot more than I ever intended way back in May 2019, when I just decided to file a run and be part of that process. So.
Yeah. And do you have, Rachel Artis asks, do you have any tips for atheists who are thinking about running for their local office in a conservative-leaning town? And
oh my gosh.
themes did you touch on, and how were you able to make those connections with your voters? In addition to that's what supporter Kevin Glover said.
My gosh, well, that's wonderful, and I do hope you consider and hopefully run for office. Here's the big thing I would say to start off with is look at what kind of difference you want to make in your community. Are you passionate about school and education policy? Are you excited about the opportunity that you can actually, like in my city, like try to work more on the roundabout and traffic safety? Are you interested in facilitating some sort of, conversation about, about the future of small businesses in your community? Whatever the case might be, really think about the difference you want to make, and then find that office where you can have the most agency. And again, local elections, they do not get the same kind of attention that the big glitzy, national ones do, but really you can make such great impact. So I'd say start with the office you want, or that you're thinking of. Find the seat you want. And again, I didn't realize how wild this would be. We just kind of knew that we didn't share the same values, and that was about the end of it. But yeah, find a seat that you think has your name on it. It has your name on it. And really just go out there, find the endorsements also that, if you're wanting to do that, that really also share your aligned values. And at least as far as me, because, I was to some extent an out, atheist and humanist, etc. But as also somebody who didn't get that question at the door, I don't know if this might change, but I don't know if you would necessarily get those questions as well, because at the end of the day, your religious affiliation or lack thereof isn't, and it shouldn't be, what's making and driving that policy decision. So I don't know if that question would come up, but I think far more it'll be like, what are you doing about, this terrible intersection here? I got that question far more, and the closest I got, at least when I was running, was more just people who were religious who might say something like, oh, God bless you, and I'd be like, thanks, because they did that out of the kindness of their heart. Right. That was the best thing that, like good wishes. I'm like, okay. So yeah.
Well, I'm being told by the studio that we are out of time. So we want to thank you so much, Kristiana De Leon, for standing up for secular values and sharing this rather fraught story with us. I had no idea this was all going on. And that concludes Ask an Atheist for this week. Thank you for joining us, and be sure to check out FFRF's radio program this week. It's Professor Benjamin Cowan, author of Securing Sex, Morality and Repression in the Making of the Cold War Brazil. It has a lot to do with religion.
And if you want more information about the Freedom from Religion Foundation, check out our all-new website at ffrf.org. See you next time on FFRF's Ask an Atheist.
Freedom from religion.